This wouldn't be a beer conference in 2019 if we didn't talk about hard seltzer. This year, market research firm Nielsen, who you'll hear from very, very shortly, estimates that hard seltzer off-premise dollar sales will hit $1.5 billion. Meanwhile, the total segment could be close to $2.5 billion by the end of the year, with two players, Mark Anthony Brand's White Claw and Truly Hard Seltzer from Boston Beer Company, making up about 80% of the market share. We wanted to go deep into the segment, so Danelle Kosmal and Caitlyn Battaglia from Nielsen's beverage alcohol practice are here today to provide us with some context for what's happening in the market. They'll examine the evolution of the segment and where it could be headed, as well as give us an idea of who's buying hard seltzer, where the volume is being sourced from, and if regional seltzers are making a dent in the market. And because we always have because we always have an eye on the future, we want to know what other Beyond Beer products we should be watching, so they'll tell us what we should be keeping an eye on. So please welcome Danelle Kosmal and Caitlyn Battaglia to the stage.
Thanks, Justin. Thanks, Justin. Good morning, everybody. We can go ahead and get started. So Justin already mentioned it wouldn't be 2019 without talking about hard seltzer. How many of you already have a hard seltzer out in the marketplace, or you're planning to launch a hard seltzer in 2020? Wow, it's more than I expected. How many of you are traditional craft brewers and you don't want anything to do with hard seltzer? Thanks for being bold and honest. And how many of you like drinking hard seltzer, and how many of you also like drinking craft beer? That's what I expected too. So when Kaitlyn and I were talking about how we wanted to put this presentation together and what the message was that we wanted to share with all of you, we knew that we would be talking essentially to two different audiences. One where a craft brewer was launching or already had a hard seltzer in the marketplace. One where really no interest in hard seltzer at all. And what we've tried to do today is really put together a message for both of those needs so that you can understand who the hard seltzer drinker is, how they're drinking the alcohol category, if you have no interest in launching a hard seltzer, and then at the same time, just learning a little bit more about where hard seltzer potentially is going and what 2020 might look like.
So we're in the holiday season. I hope all of you had a wonderful Thanksgiving, and as you are thinking about the obnoxious but awesome Christmas songs that you want to sing to yourself, perhaps you add "I'm Dreaming of a Very White Claw Christmas" to your new list. This is just really an example of the fact that hard seltzer has absolutely taken over our culture. It's definitely something you can look on Twitter, you can look on Instagram. There's a lot of really punny, which is my favorite kind of category, but there's a lot of interest and conversations around hard seltzer and the way it's impacting our culture. So Danelle and I are going to be walking you through our hard seltzer presentation today, but I would be remiss if I did not mention the awesome Nielsen posse who is also at our conference today. So if you guys can raise your hands. If you have any questions throughout the conference, these folks, along with us on the stage, are more than willing to help you with questions, talk about hard seltzer, talk about not hard seltzer, whatever is your fancy. We're definitely here for conversations.
So in August, the end of August this year, Seltzers reached $1 billion in sales for 52 weeks in Nielsen off-premise channels. We project that Seltzers will reach $1.5 billion by the end of the year. So that's a lot. It's a lot of money, right? The biggest and one of the most interesting parts of it is that Seltzers did this with just over 200 items on shelf. 200 items on shelf in off-premise, over $1 billion. So for the latest 52 weeks, they're now at $1.3 billion in off-premise channels. And I wanted to give a little bit of a comparison, because that's kind of abstract, right? Like, how big is $1.3 billion in Nielsen off-premise channels, and what are some comparisons? So we'll start with a segment like Sauvignon Blanc, a pretty big segment in wine. It's been growing over the past several years. It's a popular segment. Sauvignon Blanc, by the way, has about 1,600 items selling in off-premise channels. Bringing it a little closer to home, Craft beer 12 packs at about $1.2 billion in Nielsen off-premise channels. And the ever popular craft beer IPAs in Nielsen off-premise channels at $1.5 billion. And by the way, about 3,600 items selling on shelf and off-premise. So when we think about what hard seltzers have done in just a couple of years, with just over 200 items on shelf, it's really impressive. In terms of how big seltzers are in the beer category, they represent about 5% of total category dollars. And in this case, when we talk about category, it's beer, flavored malt beverage, and cider. There were some questions at the end of the summer of, were we going to see this big drop off? At Seltzer's peak, they reached about 5.4% of share of the category, and they're still at 5% right now. So we saw a little bit of a dip in September, but really not that much, and they continue to maintain share in terms of the category. Another thing to point out is their growth rates. Their growth rates are about 250% right now. We saw growth rates of around 200% in the summer, so their growth rates are increasing. When we talk about seltzer, I think it's also important to talk about seltzer category today. We're really talking about 2 or 3 brands, right? And Justin spoke to this, of what White Claw and Truly represent in terms of the marketplace. One of the most common questions that we get is when we're talking about White Claw, are they continuing to gain share? Are they losing share? As we see more and more players enter the market, what's happening to White Claw? And they're really maintaining share. And in fact, in 2019, they were able to increase share. Nielsen actually this week made an announcement about our innovation, our breakthrough innovation winners. White Claw was one of the few that were recognized. We see them as a brand and a product that really they were able to stand out on shelf and maintain momentum over a couple of years. So hard seltzers now aren't all the same. For the first couple of years when we saw seltzers launch, we saw the first couple of brands play in the space of definitely speaking to the health and wellness drinker and really playing on those benefits. Talking about 100 calories, they're low sugar, low carb, 5% ABV, playing much more in the flavor profile. That's a very palatable flavor profile and has mass appeal. Then we start to see some entrants like Henry's, a little bit lower ABV, a little bit lower calories. Wild Basin was one of the first major craft brands to launch, and they launched within that space around White Claw and Truly. Then, more recently, in the past couple of months, and in 2019, we saw some new entrants like Natty Light Hard Seltzers, which are doing really well, playing at a little bit higher ABV, a much lower price point, and a little bit higher calorie range. And with the recent introduction of PBR and now Four Loko just a couple of weeks ago. So Four Loko launched at 12% ABV. We gather that the calorie count is going to be much higher, and Pabst's calorie count is a little higher too. So obviously, new entrants coming in, not playing within the health and wellness space. So 2020, we're definitely going to start to see new segments develop within the total hard seltzer segment.
So as Danelle mentioned, as you've kind of look at the entrance within the hard seltzer space, it's really gone through this journey, this evolution, and it's still evolving today. We're really going to serve as your hard seltzer ghosts of past, present, and future in the presentation today. That's really our goal for you. And we're going to kind of explore 4 major components. So we're going to talk about the when, so what are the occasions, what are the time periods that people are drinking hard seltzer, the who's the consumer? That's a question that a lot of people are asking. The where, so what are the geographic implications of hard seltzer? And then finally, the what. So not only does a winning hard seltzer look like, but what are some of those other beyond beer segments that Justin mentioned when he was introducing us that are finding success similar to hard seltzer in this space that they've carved out? I also want to mention that we are really excited to have folded in some data from one of our connected partners, Social Standards. So what they do is they actually mine public Instagram data, and it allows us to bring a whole new level around conversations happening around hard seltzer. So you'll notice quite a few of their slides with their logo at the bottom in our presentation today. So let's dive into the when. As we know in beer, seasonality is a very important component in the category, particularly that summer time period. 4th of July can be a make or break week for a lot of brands. So we wanted to look at how seasonality in 2019 for hard seltzer measured up to seasonality in 2018. So what we've done here is we've taken dollar contribution for these assigned. So on the left, it's holidays. On the right, it's time periods. We compared it to 2019 in blue, then compared to 2018 in gray. So what do we see? So starting with 4th of July, key beer holiday. In 2019, it actually didn't contribute quite as many dollars to the total hard seltzer dollars as it did in 2018. So 2018, we saw a little bit more importance placed on 4th of July. However, contrast that with Labor Day, where you see that the numbers are fairly comparable between 2018 and 2019. So let's look at a more macro picture to start picking apart what that means. So in the top right, we're going to talk about the summer. So when we think of summer, we really define it as the weeks between Memorial Day and Labor Day. That's kind of our summer time period that we're looking at. So summer in 2019, not quite as important as it was in 2018. But when you move down to that bottom right-hand quadrant, that's really where we're starting to see hard seltzer continue to extend its runway in terms of its importance. So the remaining weeks is all the weeks that we have data for since Labor Day. And what you can see is that in 2019, we've seen that runway continues beyond the summer time period. So Danelle was talking earlier about the fact that growth rates have increased, share is stable in the category, and we're really seeing that seasonality is still very important to hard seltzer, but it's managed to extend that seasonality a little bit more and find success outside of those key time frames. We see the same thing when we start to talk about people talking about hard seltzer. So these are conversations. This is that social standards data I was talking about. So the blue bars are total beverage alcohol conversations. So any conversation about anything in beverage alcohol. In 2018, what you can see is there was some interest in hard seltzer. It was an interesting topic. People wanted to talk about it. In 2019, not only did the number increase dramatically in terms of the percentage of conversations around hard seltzer, but it actually, at its peak, outpaced all conversations around beverage alcohol. So it is clearly a very hot topic for people on Instagram to talk about within the beverage alcohol space. So when people are talking about hard seltzer, what are they doing it in context to in terms of occasions? This is, I think, perhaps one of the most interesting and illustrative points around some of the evolution of the types of products that we've seen that Danelle spoke to earlier. So when we look at summer 2018, the topics that were kind of top of mind for hard seltzer were really health and wellness tied. There was some talk about socialization and the social gatherings that hard seltzer was part of, but keto, low calorie, low carb, all very important parts of the hard seltzer conversation. When you shift to 2019, that conversation has really shifted quite a bit more to that social gathering, socialization, kind of social component of the hard seltzer conversation. Health and wellness is still part of the conversation, but as we see in the products that are coming out, it's not the only space that you have to play in to be part of this segment. We've seen other categories that have come before that are kind of alternative fringe segments that have done similar things in terms of carving out new spaces and new occasions for their products. I actually attribute a lot of this to craft beer. Craft beer really started to pave the way for that third channel, alternative channel. It was in cans. You could take it in places that you couldn't take bottles. We see things for other products where they're also starting to go into those alternative spaces. A can go to a pool a lot easier than a bottle can. So canned wine, canned cocktails, hard seltzer, craft beer are all finding new occasions and new opportunities in these spaces that are a little bit more friendly based on their packaging format.
All right, so next question is who is the hard seltzer consumer? Nielsen recently finished a study where we looked at hard seltzer buyers and how they're purchasing the rest of the alcohol category, and we found some pretty interesting things from it. If anybody's interested in learning more about it, feel free to talk to any of us from Nielsen afterwards. One of the big things that we found is that hard seltzer drinkers are really engaged in alcohol. On average, they're spending about $220 a year more on alcohol than the average drinker. That's a lot. So they're spending $477 a year on alcohol versus the average drinker that's spending about $260 a year on alcohol, and that's for off-premise use. Another interesting piece of this is they're increasing their spend on alcohol year over year. So their alcohol spend is up 10% for this past year versus year ago. So one of the things that tells us is that seltzer really is helping to grow the category. People who are purchasing hard seltzer, for the most part, a lot of that volume is coming from an additional purchase. That hard seltzer is an additional purchase to what they were already purchasing in alcohol. Another thing to keep in mind about the hard seltzer drinker is, as I mentioned, they're really engaged in the alcohol segment. They're also a lot more likely to purchase a lot of other hot segments across beer, wine, and spirits. They're also pretty loyal to seltzer. So seltzer has a repeat rate of 40%. That may or may not seem high to you, but when we use that and compare it to some other segments, especially segments that are hot and popular and growing. So repeat rates for something like rosé table wine, repeat rates are 35%. Repeat rates for canned wine, which is growing tremendously, those repeat rates are 28%. So repeat rate of 40% really is an indicator to say that this is a segment that's sustainable and healthy, and consumers are coming back to purchase it. So we talked about how the hard seltzer drinker is really engaged in alcohol overall. They're also engaged in craft beer. And when we look at the craft beer drinker, the craft beer buyer is 2 times more likely to purchase hard seltzer. 2 times more likely to purchase hard seltzer. So it doesn't come as a surprise, I'm sure, that when we look at what that hard seltzer buyer looks like, they look a little bit like a craft beer buyer. They tend to have higher income. They tend to be a bit younger, of 21 to 44. They live in affluent neighborhoods, and it doesn't depend if they're, it doesn't matter if they're in a city, a suburb, or a more rural area. The affluent part of it is really the main driver. They tend to be white, and they tend to be college educated. Now, something that I don't have up here that is the biggest differentiator between the hard seltzer buyer and the craft beer buyer is the gender piece of it. So I have never seen another segment in alcohol that is so gender neutral. Hard seltzer is really gender neutral, and it's really almost a 50-50 split of male-female buyers. That's something that the hard seltzer segment has been able to do and to capture in a much better way than the craft beer segment has, which, as we all know, is traditionally skewed a lot more towards male drinkers. So going back to some cool research from our friends at Social Standards, they took a look at demographics of who's chatting about hard seltzer and did an interesting comparison of who was chatting about it in 2018, in summer 2018, versus who was chatting about it in summer of 2019. And one of the biggest shifts in those demographics is the summer 2018 chatter was dominated primarily by females, where in 2019 we see more of that 50-50 split. We also see a much more diverse drinker talking about hard seltzer in 2019, with an increase of African American, Asian, and Hispanic drinkers talking about hard seltzer. So I think this just goes back to and speaks to hard seltzer's evolution and how it's really become much more of a product that has mass and broad appeal. So where are people drinking hard seltzer? We wanted an understanding of, are there SKUs regionally, and what does that look like? So hard seltzer is most developed in the West region. That's where we see the highest concentration of it, the greatest share index in terms of compared back to the total US. We also see some of the strongest growth rates in the West, and so we don't see that slowing down anytime soon. Something that came up that was pretty interesting is how hard seltzer is underdeveloped in the South, and there's still a lot of opportunity there. And in the past year, the South is actually the region where we've seen the highest actual dollar growth rate. So we think that's going to continue to be a hotspot, even though it's somewhat underdeveloped compared to other regions, a lot of opportunities for growth there. What about specific brands and if there's strength across regions? So this is looking at velocity, so how quickly products are moving on shelf. White Claw assorted is #1 across any region that you look at. But if we take that aside, you start to see some regional players popping. And this potentially could be something for you to think about as you're launching hard seltzer. If you're launching within your core market, there are definitely opportunities and strengths in doing that. So I think some examples are Vibe in the Midwest with their presence in Ohio, Rec Water in the South with their presence in Alabama. Press, the strength of Press in the West region is somewhat interesting because that isn't necessarily their home market, but they seem to be moving quickly and doing well within that region, which again is an area where hard seltzer is really developed. And so I think it potentially could speak to the trajectory of the growth of the brand for Press and where it could be going for 2020. But it's also an example of a product that is able to kind of break out in a region outside of its core market.
So to wrap things up, we wanted to dig into the what, not only the what of hard seltzer, but the what of these fringe segments in general. Starting with hard seltzer, what are those hallmarks of the hard seltzer category that we see? So when we look at the hard seltzer category to date, again, keep in mind that there's new entrants every day, and this could change. But there's 4 key components that we wanted to call out. So the first is flavor. When it comes to single flavor offerings, there's really 3 core flavors, being cherry, mango, and grapefruit. Though we did want to call out that raspberry does have very strong growth rates and is actually outpacing grapefruit in terms of growth. That being said, the next point we want to make is that variety packs absolutely dominate the hard seltzer category. They account for consistently 2/3 of the dollars within hard seltzer. As a craft audience, you'll recall that things like assorted packs and seasonal packs within the craft beer space have really struggled to find success in the past few years. So this is a really interesting differentiator for the hard seltzer category when we think about its context in the broader beer shelf. It's really found success in that idea of variety where some of its other segments just haven't managed to do so. 12 packs are definitely the most popular when it comes to format. This will be one in particular that will be really interesting to watch when we see new price points come in, as well as new pack configurations come into the category. But as we see it today, 12 packs are by far the most dominant pack configuration, and that brings us to slim cans. So slim cans account for more than 90% of dollars within hard seltzer. It's a segment that we've started to see, it's a product configuration that we've started to see elsewhere. We start to see a lot of people exploring with it, but it's interesting that it's found such great success in such a gender-neutral category because historically slim cans tended to find their way into categories that were a little bit more female skewed. So this could be a potential future, not only if you're trying to think about investing in hard seltzer, but if you're just thinking about packaging and pack configuration in general, there's definitely a lot of momentum behind that slim can kind of aesthetic. Hard seltzer definitely falls into this idea of a new drink. When we think about the experience economy, we often talk about it in context to the on-premise. People are willing to spend dollars at bars that offer axe throwing or games or yoga at a brewery, whatever it might be. But we see that the experience economy is finding a way into the off-premise as well. I mentioned cans before. These are all pictures that I found on Instagram. They're canned wines, they're canned cocktails, they're hard seltzers. Clearly, these packaging and these products are being great complements to experience in the off-premise space as well. So when you're thinking about how you want to extend your brand equity, how you want to carve out new opportunities, maybe you already have a brand that's aligned to adventures, outdoors, whatever, boating, lakes, whatever it might be. There's a lot of opportunity there to kind of capture that experience economy piece at an off-premise perspective. If you're not interested in hard seltzer, fear not. There's a couple other options you can think about. So we have found success in fringe segments beyond hard seltzer as well. Here are just a few that we wanted to call out. I know hard kombucha is one that comes up very often at Brewbound. One of the Pitch Slam brands last year actually had a hard kombucha. We see wine cocktails, so things like, my favorite cocktail is a French 75, and I can now find it in a can. Beer cocktails have actually been something that 2019 has really introduced to the market. So things like agua frescas or some of those products that are like a cocktail, but they're malt or sucrose based and they're really falling into that beer space. The newest entrant is going to be hard coffee. You'll notice there's no growth rate underneath hard coffee because honestly, minus everybody who's going to go grab one at 10:30 when they potentially put some out on the shelf. We don't have any growth rates for that because it's such a new segment, but it's one to keep an eye on to understand how these fringe segments are going to continue to grow. Because if you look at the other fringe segments, those are some strong double-digit growth numbers, much smaller total bases, but still some strong growth areas and additional opportunities for you to explore. So where does that leave you at the end of the day in terms of what you can take away from this presentation, regardless of whether you're interested in hard seltzer, you want nothing to do with hard seltzer, you just want to keep hard seltzer on your mind because you know it's out there? Well, the first thing is the idea that this idea of convenience, it carries across multiple beverage alcohol segments. So Danelle mentioned earlier that hard seltzer buyers are really engaged beverage alcohol buyers. You can tap into those hard seltzer buyer dollars with a product other than hard seltzer, potentially. So that's something to keep in mind. Create a product that resonates with your market, with your consumers, with what consumers are looking to do with beverage alcohol products these days. The second idea is the idea that it's really what hard seltzer is in the eye of the beholder is the best way to describe it. So we've seen that gender skews have changed. It's a gender equitable category. People are talking about it differently. They've gone from talking about the calorie conscious components to it to focusing a little bit more on social occasions. As we continue to see new products come into the segment, they're catering to different components of those consumers. And we would venture that we'll see distinct segments and distinct kind of segments break up within hard seltzers in general.
So we talked about velocity across regions, and so if you are planning on launching, one thing to remember is just think about that. If you're building out that sales story, what are some of the key driving factors and things that you can talk about? You can talk about velocity. You can think about where you're going to launch and what that growth pattern will look like. And it might be a really smart play to launch within your core market where you already have a lot of knowledge and equity built in that space. And then finally, catering to consumer needs. At Nielsen, we would say understanding what the consumer wants and needs is the most important step. So really understanding what that consumer need is and the consumer that you're going after. And also understanding that there are a couple of big players within the hard seltzer space right now where they tend to have a lot of broad and mass appeal. Not everyone is going to be able to play in that space, and it's very unlikely that a lot more players will be able to play in that space. So find your niche. What's it going to be? Is it going to be according to, is it going to be a low ABV range or a really high ABV range? Is it going to be based on flavor profiles? Is it going to be based on a new brand that you develop that creates a lot of excitement for consumers? So again, it's really about understanding who that consumer is, what their needs are, and then the product that you can create to meet those needs. So with that, we would
thank you all.
Thank you. I think we have some time for questions. And I did want to say that I saw a lot of people taking pictures. We're happy to share this presentation out with everyone. Feel free to take a picture of our emails and just shoot us an email and we'll send it out.
We've got a couple of minutes for questions here, so fire away. I'm already getting a few. That was, how do they say it? Truly interesting. It's so lame. Sorry, I had to do it. We got one through. You guys mentioned that there's a lot of concentration of hard seltzer sales in the West. What do you think is driving that?
Trends, a lot of trends in general tend to start in the West. Trends start on the coast. This trend started on the West Coast, and I think it's just had a little bit more time to develop there.
And I'd say, as we've seen, sorry.
Oh, no, you're fine.
I would say, as we've seen, just in the terms of like the occasions that people are using, the West Coast, in particular California, the weather also helps it, where lakes, pools, all those are a little bit more year-round accessible, and it allows you to kind of develop a little bit more, whereas, the Northeast, how many inches of snow do you have in Boston right now?
Quite a bit. More than I want to admit. But it was something that started in the Northeast with Spike Seltzer, and then AB bought it. So why do you think it lags in the Northeast? Is it just that we're that much colder? That we have crappy weather?
Weather can impact a lot.
I hear about weather so much in this industry. I feel like
but I think that's one of the reasons why we found that it's underdeveloped in the South. That's interesting because there's so much opportunity there.
Question here, overall cider trends are down 10% or so this year, attributable to Angry Orchard declines, no doubt. But does Nielsen think cider consumers are switching to seltzer?
There's definitely an interaction there. From what we've seen so far, ciders aren't losing market share based among that hard seltzer group, but there's definitely interaction there. I do think that when we talk about ciders overall, though, I mean, regional players and local ciders are still doing well. So that's also that segment within a segment of the smaller players that are doing well.
What do we know about hard seltzer consumer brand loyalty?
We haven't been digging into brand loyalty yet. That's something that we're happy to do, though, if anybody wants to explore it.
And so primarily, where are we seeing this source from? Is it primarily the light lager drinker that's coming over? Or is it wine drinker? Is it spirit drinker?
So really, I think it's funny because we get this question so often, and I think people want an actual, they so badly want us to say like 30% of dollars are coming from this specific style. And really, a lot of the volume, the seltzer volume, is coming from people just purchasing and expanding their alcohol purchases. So not necessarily swapping out one for the other, just expanding their purchases. When they are swapping out, it's coming from a little bit from beer, some from wine, and some from spirits. So it's coming from everywhere.
What do you see as the perceived wellness benefit that seltzer is tapping into and delivering to consumers?
I think when hard seltzers originally came out, they aligned really well with the keto craze and how keto was definitely really popular at the same time. And so that carb number was definitely something that differentiated them. So you can drink, Michelob Ultra is a really great example of something that's done, it's similar, where it's a product that you can still indulge when you're restricting yourself to specific diets, and it doesn't have to be the keto diet. That's just one that was very trendy at the time. But you can still be health conscious for both carbs and calorie. I know sugar kind of takes this funny journey through life. Right now, it's kind of taboo. You know, in 10 years, they'll tell us all to eat sugar every day again. But definitely, it aligned in terms of its product profile. It aligned a lot to some of the health conversations that were happening at the time.
Yeah. Well, we got to wrap this up. You guys sent a lot of great questions. These guys will be hanging out, so you can ask them in person. I also, please give Kaitlin a round of applause, because this is her last hurrah at Brewbound Live. She's moving to a different role at Nielsen, right? So thank you for all you've done.
Thank you, Justin.
Kaitlin is getting promoted, and it's a well-deserved promotion.